So we've got Emma Parker, just said she's a volunteer coordinator for Diabetes UK. I just thought we'd put everybody, I think, is on mute anyway. We'll just go with the normal standard rules of everybody's on mute. There's the chat box if anybody wants to put a question in. We'll let you do your presentation, Emma, first, and then we'll go to questions and answers and either hand up or questions in the chat box. Is that okay with you?
Sounds perfect.
I'll hand over to you then.
Thank you. So I'm going to try to not bore everyone to death with PowerPoint, but I do have a presentation, so I'll go through that. But if at any point, there's only a few of us, so if at any point anybody has any questions, just let me know. But after that, then we can just have a more informal chat and things. You can ask anything as well, but please feel free to interrupt me throughout if needed. So all being well.
Famous last words.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Maybe start at the start rather than the end. That would be a good place to start. So yeah, this is our general awareness presentation. So what I'm going to be talking about is who Diabetes UK are and what we do, a bit about diabetes as a condition, the impact of diabetes nationally and locally, the impact of living with diabetes. So what is diabetes? So most people will be familiar that diabetes is a condition that occurs in the pancreas, and it's where the pancreas either isn't producing enough insulin or isn't producing any insulin, so therefore it's not working properly. So we've got a little video that was very kindly voiced over by Philip Schofield, if you'll recognise his voice. I've set the sound to share, but do let me know if you can't hear it, but all being well, you should.
There are two main types of diabetes, type 1 and type 2. They're different conditions, but they're both serious. There are some other rarer types of diabetes too. What all types of diabetes have in common is that they cause people to have too much glucose in their blood. But we all need some glucose. It's what gives us our energy. We get glucose when our bodies break down the carbohydrates that we eat or drink, and that glucose is released into our blood. We also need a hormone called insulin. It's made by our pancreas, and it's insulin that allows the glucose in our blood to enter our cells and fuel our bodies. If you don't have diabetes, your pancreas senses when glucose has entered your bloodstream and releases the right amount of insulin so the glucose can get into your cells. But if you have diabetes, this system doesn't work. When you've got type 1 diabetes, you can't make any insulin at all. If you've got type 2 diabetes, it's a bit different. The insulin you make either can't work effectively or you can't produce enough of it. In both types of diabetes, because glucose can't get into your cells, it begins to build up in your blood. And too much glucose in your blood causes a lot of different problems. To begin with, it leads to diabetes symptoms like having to wee a lot, being incredibly thirsty and feeling very tired. You may also lose weight, get infections like thrush, or suffer from slow-healing wounds. Over a long period of time, high glucose levels in your blood can seriously damage your heart, your eyes, your feet, and your kidneys. These are known as the complications of diabetes. But with the right treatment and care, people can live a healthy life. And there's much less risk that someone will experience these complications. If you've got diabetes, you can find lots of information and support about living with it using our website and helpline. As well as campaigning for everyone with diabetes to get the right care, Diabetes UK fund research into all types of diabetes so we can develop new treatments and one day find a cure. You can find out more about type 1 and type 2 diabetes and how they're treated in our next videos.
So we do have 2 more videos on our website narrated by Philip Schofield, don't know why I think we're best friends, that go into a little bit more detail, but of a similar vein, like a quick overview. There's loads of content on our YouTube channel as well, so I'd always recommend that. There's some really, really nice videos from people living with diabetes. And things which are lovely. So the 2 most prevalent types of diabetes are type 1 and type 2. There are other much rarer types which I'll touch on a little bit later on, but for the purposes of most of our awareness presentations, we do focus on type 1 and type 2 unless asked otherwise, just because they are so much more common. But we do provide support and information for people with the rarer types of diabetes as well. So about 90% of people living with diabetes have type 2, 8% of people living with diabetes have type 1, and the rarer types such as gestational diabetes, mature onset diabetes, they make up about 2% of people living with diabetes. All these numbers are rising. We're seeing gestational diabetes being more prevalent. Part of that can be down to we're more aware and people are getting tested for it. Other parts are obviously lifestyle and other things that may be increasing risk of diabetes to increase. So type 1 and type 2 diabetes are very often mixed up and are both very often misunderstood in like the media and things. It's something that we regularly have to battle against as an organisation. So, and part of it's understandable because they do have the same symptoms, but they are quite different conditions. So type 1 diabetes, genetics only plays a relatively small part. So if you can see at the bottom of the table, in the genetic link, if your mother has type 1, it increases your likelihood by only 2 to 4%, and then father, it's a little bit more. If both parents, it shoots up quite a bit more to 30%. The sibling has it, it goes up to 10%, identical twin, 30 to 70%. So it's much harder with type 1 diabetes to kind of track any genetic link or to kind of assess someone's risk of type 1 diabetes. It's a really interesting area of research that is being looked into at the moment, because if we can spot any markers that might indicate someone will develop type 1 diabetes, that offers us the opportunity to maybe intervene and kind of kick the can down the road a little bit, or offer other treatments in the meantime that may delay it. Type 2 diabetes actually has a much higher genetic element than type 1 diabetes. So if diabetes is in your family, then that makes you 2 to 6 more times likely to have diabetes than somebody without diabetes in the family. And there's the other risk factors as well for type 2 diabetes. So age, family history, ethnicity, weight, waistline, and high blood pressure as well. So the key differences between type 1 and type 2 is in type 1, there is no insulin made. Occasionally in people with type 1 diabetes, they may trace the tiniest bit of insulin, but it's so minimal, it amounts to nothing really. Whereas in type 2 diabetes, there generally is insulin, it's just the insulin that is there, there's either not enough of it or it's not working properly. Again, type 2 diabetes is a progressive condition, so we often find that people living with type 2 diabetes end up needing insulin treatment themselves because their insulin levels get so low they then need to use insulin treatments too. Age, with type 1 diabetes, it used to be known as juvenile diabetes. It's no longer, because whilst it is still most common in people living below the age of 40, and by that we mean diagnosed, because obviously type 1 diabetes, once you have it, unless you get a pancreas transplant, you do live with it for life. But we are starting to see people getting diagnosed a little bit older than in the past. It's still predominantly diagnosed in children and young adults, but we have seen some people getting diagnosed in the 50s, in the late 40s, and we're not 100% sure as to why we're seeing that trend occurring. It could be something environmental, something that as a society we're doing more that we didn't used to do. Our immune systems are being impacted in a different way. We're not 100% sure. Whereas type 2 diabetes is more common in people over the age of 40, unless you are from the Black and South Asian ethnicity, in which case we start to see that risk increase from just the age of 25. So the onset, type 1 diabetes comes on very, very quickly, and often, too often, is diagnosed at the point of a medical emergency. Whereas type 2 diabetes comes on very slowly, which has its own problems, because that often means that people get complacent with their diabetes care, or they're not diagnosed until they're already at a point of having a complication, because the symptoms, they come on so slowly and they're so similar to just feeling a bit run down, just generally getting older, having a bit of a rough week. So we do just kind of ignore them for longer and then get diagnosed when we're already suffering a complication. So in terms of treatment, type 1 diabetes is always treated with insulin, and then diet and physical activity can also help in supporting blood sugars, but insulin is absolutely always needed. With type 2 diabetes, it'll often be started on just treating through diet and physical activity, but then they may introduce medication to aid with weight loss and things, such as metformin. Then later down the line, like I said, people may end up on insulin if their insulin is at such a low amount that they then also need to inject or use a pump. If somebody with type 2 does start to use insulin, they still have type 2 diabetes. There's often a bit of confusion as to whether they then progress into type 1, but they're still very different conditions and remain different. So there's no kind of transitional in from one. We do often find that people get misdiagnosed, which again causes confusion, because people then think that, oh, I've gone from type 1, I've transitioned from type 1 to type 2 as if that's the progression, but that's just misdiagnosis. So once they've found which type of diabetes you have, that will remain consistent. There's not one in a hierarchy that is a worse version of the other, so to speak. So what causes type 1 diabetes? It's mostly unknown at the moment, but there's lots of research going into that, because like I said, it'd be so helpful if we can pinpoint any kind of risk factors or anything. But it could be the result of a viral or other infection. So type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune condition. So our immune system is essentially seeing the cells that create insulin and seeing them as something that it needs to attack and get rid of, which is how people living with diabetes end up with type 1 diabetes, end up with no insulin. So there's some really interesting thoughts out there at the moment as to whether an impact later down the line of the COVID-19 pandemic may be that we see more people end up getting diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, because we do know this is a virus that is vastly impacting on our immune systems, and it may trigger our immune systems into overdrive and result in this, possibly. It's like I say, it's just a theory at the moment and something that is a possibility. There is the genetic element as well with type 1 diabetes. Got an interesting story from one of our volunteers actually around his type 1 diagnosis. He was diagnosed when he was 49, and he had gone backpacking in South America, and he had been bitten by a scorpion and got really poorly as a result of it. And about 6 months later, after he'd recovered, he'd come back to the UK, he got diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And so for ages, he made the joke that he got it from the scorpion. Spider-Man got superpowers, he got type 1 diabetes. Anyway, his diabetes specialist nurse actually picked him up on it and was like, you might have a point, and went away and came back to his next appointment with some research, and the venom in this particular scorpion didn't interfere with the immune system. So it's very likely that the venom from the scorpion triggered his immune system into this kind of attack that's going on with, which had led to him having diabetes, because the immune system was just overactivated. And so very possibly he got it from a scorpion. Type 2 diabetes is, we're able to predict it a little bit more, but there's some risk factors that over the years we've found out about and now can allow us to see whether somebody may be naturally more at risk of developing type 2 diabetes. So age, this is because, like with everything, unfortunately, as we get older, our pancreas also stops functioning as well, which is why we see reduced insulin production. Family history, I've already touched on, that has a really big impact on somebody's risk of diabetes, and this is something that we often see the media get wrong quite a lot. Like, again, ultimately, weight and waist circumference are the biggest factors in determining someone's risk of type 2 diabetes, but family history is probably quite high up there as well, and that's why we see lots of people getting diagnosed with type 2 diabetes who actually aren't overweight or morbidly obese. People can develop type 2 diabetes without having a high BMI. It is completely possible. An example of that is Sir Steve Redgrave, the Olympic rower. Ethnicity as well is another one. So we do know that certain ethnic backgrounds increase your risk of developing type 2 diabetes, which again means that people from these backgrounds only need to actually gain a little bit of weight, or sometimes none at all, to suddenly find themselves at a greater risk of developing type 2 diabetes. So again, weight is the biggest factor in the UK particularly, but these other two, family history and ethnicity, also do play a big part in the reason why more people have type 2 diabetes. So it's not a purely a condition that is from weight. And actually, if we're from a white European background, we can actually manage with a higher BMI than somebody from a South Asian background before developing type 2 diabetes. So there's all these different factors that kind of come in together to increase your risk. And if you have a family history of diabetes, if you're from an ethnicity that is more at risk, then you are already much more likely to get diabetes than somebody who's maybe overweight from a European background as well. So a little bit there about that. Gestational diabetes, so if you've had diabetes whilst you were pregnant, in most cases, once you have the baby, your blood sugars will return to normal, but you will be then monitored afterwards, because this then puts your risk up of developing type 2 diabetes in the future. If you've got another condition that's impairing your glucose regulation, depression and severe mental illness is another one, and this is because either the lifestyle that people live whilst they're unwell with mental illness often can lead to maybe people isolating at home quite a lot, not getting out and exercising as much, not always using comfort foods and things that can increase the risk. And likewise, people who are being treated, some of the medications that they use to treat some severe mental illnesses can include either an increased appetite as a side effect or weight gain as a side effect. So that's obviously something to be aware of. And women with history of polycystic ovaries or who gave birth to a particularly big baby as well. And this all relates to hormones, and because insulin is also a hormone. So and polycystic ovaries is all about hormonal imbalance and things. So this can also lead to somebody being more at risk of type 2 diabetes. So some of the symptoms of diabetes. So the first one is losing weight without trying to, feeling more tired than usual, going to the toilet a lot, especially at night, being really thirsty and not being able to quench your thirst no matter how much you drink, genital itching or thrush, blurred eyesight, cuts and wounds taking longer to heal. So the difference between type 1 and type 2, like I said earlier, is the onset. So the more with type 1, these symptoms come on really, really, really quickly, and it's really important that if somebody's experienced these symptoms, they seek medical treatment, because if not, they could then be diagnosed when they're already really, really ill. And as mentioned again earlier, with type 2 diabetes, these come on really slowly. And then that means that, again, we just, put it to the back of our mind. I mean, if I was losing weight without trying to, I'd be like, yeah, this is great. I wouldn't be thinking anything necessarily of it, but feeling more tired. Again, we write that off so often with just, have I not been sleeping that great? Has work been a bit much? All these symptoms are kind of also symptomatic of busy lifestyles. So we push it back and push it back. And then this is what leads to people getting diagnosed. The statistic actually is that people can live for up to 10 years with type 2 diabetes without knowing. So it's really important that more people are aware of the symptoms, and if they have them, to go to the GP and just get checked out. The best case scenario is a symptom of a lifestyle, or you're just getting a bit run down. But in the case where somebody might have type 2 diabetes, the quicker they're diagnosed, the better, because they can get the right support that they need. So what causes the symptoms? It's because the glucose is staying in the body rather than being used as fuel for energy. So the glucose is just building up in the blood. So then the body tries to reduce the blood glucose levels by flushing the excess out through the urine. So this is why we see people using the bathroom more, and then to replace the lost water, they're then drinking more. Also, this high levels of glucose being passed through the urine is a perfect breeding ground for fungal infections such as thrush. However, not everyone does get the symptoms. So 6 out of 10 people have no symptoms when diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. So that's why being aware of risk of diabetes is really helpful as well, because if you know that it's in your family, so that might put you more at risk, or if you're from an ethnic background where it puts you more at risk, just being aware of this means that you can start those conversations with healthcare professionals and be more aware. So even if you're not experiencing those symptoms, we have volunteers, for example, who also they don't have any of the risk factors, the symptoms themselves, but because it's so prevalent in their family, they have regular appointments with their doctors and things as well. So it's really, really good to be aware. So when I mentioned before about a lot of people with type 1 diabetes getting diagnosed when they're in a serious medical emergency, this is in reference to diabetic ketoacidosis. So this is a serious condition that mostly affects people with type 1 diabetes. Occasionally we do see it in type 2. So DKA happens when there's a severe lack of insulin in the body. So the body is unable to use sugar for energy and starts to break down our fat instead, and then releases these chemicals called ketones. The danger of them is that when they build up, they make your blood acidic. So the signs of DKA are similar to the diabetes symptoms in general. So feeling tired and sleepy, blurred vision, feeling thirsty. A lot of people also talk about breath smelling like pear drops or nail varnish, maybe. High blood sugar levels, needing to pee more. And then a lot of people have little test strips so they can check their ketones in the urine. So they might find that they're coming with high ketones in those. Having stomach pain, feeling sick, and confusion as well. So it can be really serious if it's left untreated. So if somebody is displaying these symptoms, they need to go to hospital because it is life-threatening if left untreated. So diabetes is diagnosed through one of these 4 blood tests. So the random blood glucose test, fasting blood glucose test, glucose tolerance test, or glycated hemoglobin test. So a lot of people get mixed up when they see pharmacies offering finger prick tests. They aren't diagnosing of diabetes. They are a good indicator, but they can't diagnose it because they're only looking at a snapshot of what your blood is in that moment. So if you've just eaten something quite sugary, your results are going to come out really that you've got a really high blood glucose level. But that isn't to say that you always have a high blood glucose level. And also things like stress and if we're ill, all these impact on our blood sugar as well. So they're helpful to do these on the spot capillary blood tests. And they can be a good indicator, but they do not diagnose. So often what will happen is somebody does one of the finger prick tests at one of these maybe walk-ins, then they'll be referred to go to the doctor who'll then do one of these 4 blood tests to have a picture of what's going on with your bloods over a longer period of time. And they can look at that and then make the diagnosis. So in the video, Philip Schofield mentioned some of the complications of diabetes. So he mentioned that it affects eyesight. So this is called retinopathy, and this is when the blood sugar gets really high and starts to damage the retina in your eye. So you start seeing like spots in front of your vision. The good news about retinopathy is once spotted, it can be halted. So it is progressive, but if someone spots it, we can stop it from developing into being blind. It can't be reversed though. So once it's started, we can't then take your eyesight back to how it was. But we do have a lot of opticians who are aware of it now, and it's getting spotted a lot earlier. It used to be the leading cause of blindness in the UK. It's no longer the top cause, I don't believe. I think that's glaucoma now, but don't quote me on that, I could be wrong. So we've seen a lot of developments in terms of retinopathy over the years, which is fantastic news. Cardiovascular disease, so heart attacks and strokes, are one of the really most common complications and one of the most deadly complications as well. Nephropathy, so kidney disease. So as mentioned, when your blood sugar levels are really high, your body is desperately trying to flush out the excess sugar, and this in turn damages the kidneys. So this is where we often see if somebody's diabetes is being left untreated and they're having problems with the kidneys, this is because the kidneys have started to shut down basically, and they may need a kidney transplant. Neuropathy, nerve disease. So this is what leads to amputations if left untreated. So again, high blood sugar level starts to kill the nerves, especially in our feet. This then means that we stop feeling things. So people have talked about having things in the shoe that they've not known were there. They may have cut their foot and not realised, and this in turn may get infected. which can then lead to an amputation being needed in the very worst case scenario. So it's really important for people living with diabetes to regularly check their feet themselves. They have yearly appointments, which includes the eyes tested as well, but to look at the feet with a podiatrist. But it's really important that they're constantly checking for any cuts, any ulcers, and getting, if they do spot anything, getting treatment for it straight away. And there's lots of different tips on our website for people with diabetes and what they can do day to day just to make sure that their feet are okay. And as mentioned, this can lead to foot and lower leg amputation. Sexual dysfunction is another one. Depression and poor emotional health. So I mentioned earlier about how having mental health conditions can lead to a risk of type 2 diabetes. And in reverse, people living with diabetes are much more at risk of developing depression because it's a long-term condition. It's something that people live with every single day. And it takes a huge toll having to always be aware of what you're eating, what exercise you're doing, and living with self-medicating with, I mean, in terms of delivering your own insulin and your medication, it's a lot to be leaving people to manage 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. And this can lead to diabetes distress and diabetes burnout, which is where people start to neglect their treatment and because they're just so overwhelmed by it. So we actually do have a campaign going on at the moment, which I will mention later on. And as I said, this leads to diabetes distress and problems in pregnancy as well. People with diabetes can absolutely have pregnancies and have very healthy babies, but they will have more monitoring going on whilst they are pregnant. They'll have more checks with the midwives and a bit more support just to ensure that baby's all right, and mum as well, managing her diabetes whilst pregnant. So hypos and hypers are really common things that people will have heard of from diabetes. So hypos are hypoglycemia, and this is when the blood glucose level is too low. They can come on really quickly. And a hyper is hyperglycemia, so that's when the blood sugar levels are too high. So just some symptoms for hypos, and there's quite a few here of these. There is blurred vision, feeling tearful, sweating, headaches, lack of concentration, trembling and shaking, lips feeling tingly, palpitations and a fast pulse, going pale, and tiredness. So you can see a lot of these are ones that you'd only notice internally. It'd be hard to spot as an outsider. But there's a few, if you know somebody really well and you know that they have diabetes and you see that they're going pale, if you start to notice that maybe they're losing their train of thought, they seem a bit out of it, they're sweating maybe. You may, if you've got a relationship with them where you're able to do that, you may be feel able to ask them and say, oh, are you feeling okay? Is your diabetes okay? And that can be really helpful because sometimes people living with diabetes may lose hypo awareness, which is where they stop being able to kind of notice it in themselves, and they wouldn't know that they were going into hypo unless they did a finger prick test, or by when they've been treated and like, oh gosh, yeah, I was hypoing then. So if you have a good relationship with somebody, you know them quite well, it might be able to spot these signs. It's really helpful. We don't always know why hypos happen, but we do know some things that may make them more likely to happen. So if somebody misses or delays a meal or snack, if they don't have enough carbohydrate, if they've done a lot of exercise without having the extra carbohydrate or haven't reduced their insulin dose to make way for this exercise, if somebody has taken more insulin than needed, drinking alcohol on an empty stomach. So hypers, there's a few less symptoms, and you'll notice that these echo the symptoms of diabetes as a whole. So feeling more tired, being thirsty, passing urine more often, and getting a headache as well. So when people are diagnosed with diabetes, their body is kind of in a hyper permanently because your blood sugar levels are just constantly peaking at this high. So why do hypers happen? So if somebody's missed a dose of their medication, if they've eaten more carbohydrate than their body can cope with, if somebody's stressed, or if they're unwell. A lot of people I know who live with diabetes can tell in advance that they're getting ill because they start to see their blood sugar starting to spike. or if they've overtreated a hypo. So unfortunately, what can often happen is somebody can be having a hypo and may accidentally take too much carbohydrate to help with that and then send themselves into a hyper. So diabetes, living with diabetes, it is a constant balancing act. So diabetes and ethnicity, just wanted to touch on this because I have mentioned a few times that ethnicity puts you more at risk dependent on your ethnic background. So as you can see here from this very rough bar chart, just to give a little bit of idea of some different ethnicities and the risk they put you at of type 2 diabetes. So as you can see, the South Asian background, so people from Pakistani background, for example, particularly raises your risk of developing type 2 diabetes at both a younger age and lower BMI. So this is due to a combination of genetics and environmental factors. Again, we don't have a perfect answer for this. There are working theories, there's research going on into this. Some theory spans whether it's around the diets in our different cultures and whether certain cultural foods maybe they've got naturally higher sugars in them, potentially higher carbohydrate based. There's other really interesting research that looks at just I can't think of the word now, the placement of fat on our bodies and where we carry it, and whether different ethnicities are more likely to carry it around their waist and therefore impacting on the liver and pancreas, whereas other ethnicities maybe carry the weight more on the hips and things, which is why they may be less likely. So there's loads of really interesting theories, but nothing definitive at the moment. So like I say, we're funding research into that. So it's something that we're very hopeful to have an answer on one day. At the moment, we do just know this is a fact. So we're particularly trying to work with people from these communities, and we've got some fantastic volunteers who just are amazing at raising awareness out in their communities about diabetes and just doing amazing work. So why awareness is important? So as I've said, early diagnosis and good control of blood glucose levels can prevent complications from happening. Also, it greatly reduces somebody's risk of complications as well. And diabetes is a very misunderstood condition. So the more awareness, the less discrimination for people living with diabetes. So a little bit about Diabetes UK now. So our overall vision is for a world where diabetes can do no harm. So we are the biggest charity in the UK for funding diabetes research and for supporting people living with diabetes. We are trying to prevent the type 2 diabetes where we can. We're always campaigning to support everyone affected by diabetes. And ultimately, the vast majority of the funds that we raise go straight into research to eventually fund a cure. And whilst working on that, funding lots of different research that looks at making advances in technology, advancing in medicine, all to make the lives of people living with diabetes much better. So every 5 years, we have a look at our strategy and make sure that everything is, if it's reflecting the times that we live in, any societal changes that have happened, any changes in law. So in 2020, we launched our new strategy, which has had to be adapted because this launched in January and then we had a global pandemic hit in March. So, but our aims is to still create a world where diabetes can do no harm. So our underlying thought throughout all this is that diabetes is relentless, but so are we. We know that diabetes is on the rise. 1 in 15 of us is now living with it, but we strongly believe that we can fight harder than ever before and help more people living with diabetes have better outcomes in their healthcare and to live much better than a word, because you know, if you have diabetes, you can absolutely live a perfectly happy and healthy life, but to have access to the support that they need, and that's what I was looking for. So we have 5 outcomes from our strategy that we'd like to see. So we would like to see more people with type 1, type 2 and all other forms of diabetes benefit from new treatments that will cure or prevent the condition. This is kind of our pledge to try to do our bit to support ending this kind of postcode lottery that we see with health. We'll often see that, you know, different places have different criteria for getting certain equipment, and we'd like to see an end to that. We'd like it so wherever you live, you have the same access to the technology as the person in a neighbouring county. and your postcode basically doesn't define the treatment that you get. We'd like to see more people in remission from type 2 diabetes. We'd like to see more people get the quality of care they need to manage their diabetes well. We'd like to see fewer people getting type 2 and gestational diabetes. And we want more people with diabetes to live better and more confident lives with diabetes, free from discrimination. So we know that some of these will happen quicker than others, but we're going to work really hard at all of these. We know that the pandemic has taken a real toll, particularly on people living with diabetes. People have found that their healthcare their appointments have been pushed back. They're having to do appointments online that they hadn't before and struggling with access to technology to do that. We know that people are getting diagnosed much later than they would have done. There's been a real impact on diabetes care because of the pandemic, and we want to be here to support that and to keep shouting for people living with diabetes and to advocate for them as well. So this is just a little picture there of how we're hoping to do this. So through tackling inequalities is a big thing that we'll be working on. Again, the pandemic has really highlighted a lot of the inequalities that are already existing in our society and really brought them to the forefront of conversation. We want to be harnessing technology better than ever, promoting it, helping people get access to it, educating people about it as well. And as an organisation, we ourselves will always be learning and improving as well. So there's a few different ways that we help. So we have our information. So on our website, on also information that we publish, we have information about living with diabetes, information with recipes. We've got things for mental health support. We've got our learning zone as well, which is really, really good. So our learning zone is something that people living with diabetes can log on to, and they'll answer some questions which will tailor the content specifically to them, and then it'll provide them with relevant kind of online courses they can dip in and out of, or to learn more about their diabetes and empower them. We've also got our helpline, which is open Mondays to Fridays, 9 AM till 6 PM, and people living with diabetes can ring up that, or people caring for people living with diabetes, or anyone who's affected by diabetes, and seek some support and advice. We also offer support, so we have our volunteer groups who are fantastic. They run support groups, they get local speakers to come along, or sometimes just meet and have a chat and be there for each other. We have our type 1 events that have currently been paused due to the pandemic, but when they resume, they're fantastic. They just bring children together and their families who live with type 1 diabetes and have them a weekend of fun and education. Parents get a little bit of respite, which is always welcomed. And for the whole weekend, the children's diabetes care is given over to the specialist doctors and nurses that volunteer and give parents a full weekend off having to worry about their child's diabetes, and parents meet other parents as well and develop a real community out of it. They are fantastic. We've also got our support forum, which again, we couldn't do that. Our fantastic volunteers. We have volunteers that monitor it throughout all hours, and people meet each other through it. They can share experience, share stories, seek support. It's a really good place. Research, again, most of the funds that we raise go straight into research to find better treatments for diabetes and ultimately a cure. And campaigning as well. We have a campaigns team who are always looking for better services for care and looking to prevent discrimination. So I mentioned some of the campaigns that we're running at the moment. So we've got around coronavirus. As I mentioned, we know that people living with diabetes have been really disproportionately affected by coronavirus. So we've been here to support getting that message out to the government and pushing back where we've needed to and asking for greater clarification when we've needed to. And then I also mentioned earlier about mental health support. So we have our It's Missing campaign. So every year people living with diabetes get regular health checks. So they'll have the bloods done, they'll have the eyesight looked at, they'll have their feet looked at. What we would like to do is have mental health checks included in this. We did some research that showed that 7 out of 10 people felt overwhelmed by living with diabetes. So we want to change that. We want to empower both doctors to be able to ask people living with diabetes how they're feeling, as well as empowering people living with diabetes to be able to ask for that support. We're working with different mental health professionals with IAPS to increase the provision for people living with long-term conditions, obviously for us specific to diabetes. We do know that some IAPS already offer specific counselling for people living with long-term conditions, so for those we're kind of piggybacking on and giving a specific view of living with diabetes into that. And we found people being really receptive, but it's something that we are going to continue fighting for, because we know, again, the pandemic has had such an impact on people's mental health. We only expect these figures, sadly, to increase, so we will be working even harder to promote that. We have our food upfront petition as well, so you'll all have seen the different traffic light labels on food packaging. What you may not be aware of is that there is no legal guideline on them. There are recommendations, but there is no compulsory consistency there. So what we would like to do is to make that happen, basically, so that, you know, when you're looking, no matter what brand of food that you're looking at in the supermarket, when it comes to the traffic lights, they're all following the same clear guidelines as to what means green, what means red, what means amber. We've also got our Flash campaign. So this is relating to a piece of technology usually used by people living with type 1 diabetes, which is the Freestyle Lever device, which is a little sensor that goes in people's arms, and it will take blood sugar readings. You get a little device that you scan over, or some people can use the phones as well to take blood sugar readings. So this is as opposed to finger prick testing. It's a really helpful piece of technology. Not everyone likes it, it's not for everyone, it's absolutely fine. But it went onto the NHS back in 2018, if I remember rightly. But as with a lot of things, we found the postcode lottery kind of hit, and different places were finding it easier to access than others. So we did a huge campaign to try to end that. And we've seen a lot of places take up the Flash device on the NHS as a result of that. But the campaign's still running, because we are still finding every now and again people still struggling to access the technology. Our type 1 diabetes make the grade, and we also have our Good Care in Schools awards for schools who are providing exemplary care for their children living with diabetes. And again, this is all about making sure that at school children feel safe, feel supported, that parents feel safe, because, you know, it's a long time to be leaving your kids' diabetes care in the hands of teachers, and teachers have a lot going on as well. So it's all about working together with schools and the government to make sure that they feel empowered to be able to support a child with diabetes. And then our type 1 diabetes essentials as well, so making sure that in regards to their healthcare, children living with type 1 diabetes are getting everything that they are entitled to. So just a little bit, so these stats were last done in 2018, so they probably will have changed again. But back in 2018, the number of people diagnosed diabetes had doubled between 1998 and 2018. The NHS spends at least £10 billion a year on diabetes, so 10% of its entire budget. And by 2030, we are expecting more than 5.5 million people to have diabetes. And again, these stats were done before the pandemic, so I'd expect that to be higher if we were to do that again now as well, given that just the impact the pandemic has had on all of us. So a little bit about what we're doing in Halton. So we're currently piloting an awareness project with schools to raise signs and symptoms of the type 1 diabetes. So this is because at a recent Cheshire and Mersey Network meeting, it was noted that during the pandemic, there'd been an increase of young children being diagnosed in DKA. So one of our colleagues, Linda, who also has a son living with diabetes, she actually suggested, well, we've got quite a few type 1 resources stored, why don't we start sending them around to schools and start to raise that awareness to the children, to the parents and the teachers. So Halton is the first area that we have chose to pilot this in. So we're sending out information packs to schools, and hopefully information to be included in their weekly newsletters too. So the aims of this is that hopefully we can encourage people to spot the signs early and to get medical help and an early diagnosis to avoid children getting diagnosed in this quite distressing DKA. So then hope that we can then roll this out wider in the north. So we've actually created a poster as part of this. So with we refer to it as the 4Ts. Obviously there are more symptoms of diabetes than this, but when we found that when we focused on the 4Ts, it's really easy to remember. children, parents. They're the 4 kind of symptoms that we see most common. It's easy to remember. So these posters are about getting those symptoms out there, but also signposting to the support that we're offering. So we've got a North of England wide Facebook group at the moment, which has been a really nice place for peer support. We've also got our office number and our helpline number, and there's also a list of resources as well there for more leaflets and posters, for more support and things as well. So this is part of what we will be putting in the pack. So how can you get involved? So become one of our amazing volunteers. Also, any fundraising is always welcome to support our research. Campaigning, we have on our website, there's different petitions that people can sign to help support writing letters to MPs, for example. And supporting our work in Halton, so you'll all be far more aware of what's on the ground than us. So if you know of any areas where you think could benefit from these posters, either by hard copy or electronically. Thank you. That is the PowerPoint. I hope it wasn't too intensive. So I will.
No, Emma, I thought that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you. Such an informative presentation. I thought the video was brilliant. And just before we go to questions, just in case I forget, is it possible that you could send that across to us and we can post that onto our website? Yes. I'm saying post, it's all the wrong terminology, but we can put it on our website. But that was absolutely brilliant. Yeah, thank you so much. And we'll go to questions. Anybody got a question that they'd like to ask? Can anybody hear me okay? Jude, did you have a question you wanted to ask?
Hi, yeah. Hello. Hi, Emma. That was a really good presentation. Thank you. I just wondered, do you have any support groups in the Halton area in Widnes or Runcorn?
We don't at the moment, but we do have some people who are interested in setting one up. So if we ever get one going, we'll be sure to let you know. And if you've got any interest in either attending one or speaking to one, a lot of our support groups have actually gone online recently and have been, so even though like our Sheffield group in particular have been fantastic at arranging speakers and different things and support, and they've been opening it up across the north online. But they're not the only group by far to do that. So we've got a lot of that going on at the moment. Not every group has taken up the option to go online, which is completely fine. It's not for everybody. We also know that we're battling with digital exclusion quite a lot in the north as well. So it doesn't, we couldn't put everything online. It wouldn't be fair and ethical. So we want to make sure that we're still also providing. So we've also got our befrienders, who are trained volunteers to offer peer support one-to-one, either over the phone or over email, who are all really brilliant, empathetic individuals who have resources to hand to signpost. They don't give any medical advice, but neither do we as an organisation either. But they can signpost people to the relevant services near them. So for areas where we don't have a support group, we've got that, and we've got our Facebook group as well, which has really taken off. It only came about as a result of the pandemic, actually, that our regional head is a registered nurse herself, and hopefully, I'm sure she won't mind me saying, she lives with type 1 diabetes and was very well known within the community. So when the pandemic started, lots of people were messaging her really worried. So she set up this Facebook group as a way to kind of put all these people in touch with each other as well, and to create this community. And it's been amazing to see people will post if they're worried about something, and just how quickly people respond and say, I've been through that as well, I'm here if you want to talk about it, or this website really helped me, or this. And then staff are on there as well, just to make sure that there isn't any errant medical advice floating around that we wouldn't recommend. But we haven't really needed to intervene that much, because people have just been so fantastic, and there's so many lovely stories on there as well, people sharing like achievements that their kids living with type 1 have managed, and it's just become such a fantastic community. I think there's like 600 members on there at the moment. So I can send a link to that to Louise later that she can share around, and the more
Oh,
the
yeah,
merrier.
please, that would be great. Yeah, because I'm sure people in Halton would be interested in joining as well. And just one more question. If we hear about more people being told they're pre-diabetic,
Yes.
do you have any information or support about that?
We do, yes. Again, I can send this to Louise as well. We've got lots of information on our website about pre-diabetes and what it means, but also some tips on advice that you can take to help start that journey to reduce your blood sugar levels. So yeah, we're hearing that term more and more, pre-diabetic. They used to have much more long-winded names for it, but I think that's a much easier one to remember. So yeah, there's also support on our website. And again, we have people similar for our Facebook group as well. That is an online forum. Also we're not just here for people living with diabetes, we're here for people at risk as well, or people who have been told that they're pre-diabetic. So there's support on our forums. They can contact our helpline, they can contact us in the north, or they can go on our Facebook group. So all the resources that we have for people living with diabetes are the same for them as well.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Wanted to hand over to Nikki from the Health Improvement Team. Nikki?
Fab, that led really nicely into what I just wanted to share. I've worked in the Health Improvement Team for years now, and I used to be a health trainer working on our weight management programme. And part of the work that we used to do the NHS health checks, which included, as was referenced earlier, the HbA1c checks and the impaired glucose regulation. It was IGR, so there's a few different names that's been around. And I just wanted to give an example just to kind of back up what you're saying about how easily you can reduce those readings and that risk factor. Because I had one of my ladies that came to one of my fresh starts. She was actually in her 70s and she'd been diagnosed as this pre-diabetic, and they'd signposted her to the weight management program, and she didn't lose a huge amount of weight, but just started exercising regularly, made those changes to her diet. I think she probably lost in total maybe about a stone over the time, but brought her blood sugar reading right down. But as a consequence as well, I think she was on about 4 blood pressure medications and only ended up on like half the dose of one of them. So like massive changes, and she was just like absolutely over the moon. So you can kind of people don't necessarily need to be like, oh my god, and that's kind of where we get people coming in saying like, oh, I've got diabetes, and they go on Google and things like that. But just making simple small changes can have a huge impact. So I just wanted to kind of back that up practically. And no age is too old either. Do you know what I mean? I think if I remember rightly, she was 73.
Yeah, I like one of those Churchill nodding dogs. Everything you said is just absolutely spot on. That's kind of, dare I say it, one of the positives is that with diabetes, small lifestyle changes can make such a big impact. And people often, they read this kind of scary headlines or they Google it and feel like they're at the beginning of this massive hill they've got to climb. But actually, just the smallest thing, it's actually nothing to do with Diabetes UK, but at my local doctors, when you're in the waiting room, they have this video on loop, and one of the little segments is from a guy who lives in Merseyside who had just increased the distance he was walking his dog every day, and it significantly reduced his blood glucose levels. And it's just really little change. I think it's so easy for like people to get frightened and feel really overwhelmed, but actually small things make such a big difference. And we often give little tips that they sound like nothing, but again, they make such a big difference. So if you get the bus, get off the bus stop or stop earlier. When you go into the supermarket, park further away from the supermarket. If you don't have any accessibility issues, and it's little things that I've taken into my life as well. Like we have, when we're in the office, we always as staff use the stairs, again as long as there's no accessibility issues. But for those of us that don't need to access the lifts, then we choose the stair. And there's such little things, but they really do. Our Sheffield group actually held a moving event back in January 2020, just before lockdowns, and one of the best pieces of advice that came out of it was one of the exercise specialists that was there said that if you say you're watching like a soap like Coronation Street or Emmerdale, one that has adverts, if you just stand up and just walk on the spot during the adverts, that massively increases your activity levels for the day. You don't have to go anywhere, you don't have to get all this expensive gear, you don't have to buy a gym membership, but that makes such a difference because you don't actually realise how often adverts are on. And it's that thing of stopping us just sitting down as long, because, you know, the way that society is these days, there's no fault of anyone's own, but everything's kind of quite online now, isn't it? And the majority of the workforce is in offices and things, so we're in jobs that naturally were sat down more. And that was even before the pandemic. So just doing little things. My watch is an absolute nightmare. It always is moaning at me like, stand up now, but you know what, it's really good because it reminds me that I've been sat down for a while. Off you go. And yeah, it's micromanaging me, but I need it. Not some people are a bit more motivated and can just, but little things, they do make a really big difference in regards to reducing risk of diabetes. So it isn't as scary, I think, as it's made out to be by some of the naughty newspapers out there.
Thank you. Anybody else got any questions? Anything that would like to ask Emma? Anybody wanted to put the hand up? Or
Louise,
yeah.
Paul and Diane have put their hands
so
up.
I couldn't quite see it on my screen. Thank you very much, Dave. Who do we? Diane, we'll go to you first.
I think.
Hi, well, I'm the type 1 diabetic in this conversation here. I've had it for 40 years. What I have noticed that during the pandemic, I personally haven't been impacted by seeing my consultant. One of them wasn't an actual seeing, it was a telephone conversation. Yeah. But I have been informed by people who are type 2 diabetics who see their GPs that their annual reviews have not been taken place. And that is a little worrying. And I've questioned as to when these are going to start taking place again. And people don't really know. And this is worrying, because if people aren't being reviewed and encouraged and things like this, their condition could deteriorate rapidly. Yeah. And do you see this from all over the country?
Yeah,
not just Halton.
No, yeah, annual reviews being pushed back is a big problem. And again, the long-term impact of this is going to be more people experiencing the complications that we know are preventable if that care is in place. What we do have in our organisation is a role called Improving Care Manager. And for us, that's Yvonne Brown. She was hoping to be here with me today, actually, but she had another meeting. But what I can do, Diane, is I can share with Louise her contact details to pass on to you. And if anybody you know of is experiencing issues in accessing their care, Yvonne's role is, it's called Improving Care Manager. And what she does is basically, I say advocates, it's not quite as formal as that, but she'll sit on meetings that CCGs are holding and things and trying to raise diabetes up the agenda. But she's also really well versed on what everybody is entitled to. So she's there to kind of support in the Northwest where people aren't getting the correct care. She can then step in and say to that local team, without kind of saying a name, or if someone's, you know, doesn't want their name to it, that's absolutely fine. But she can go in and kind of say, look, we know that this isn't being provided. So
I'm sure Dave will be interested, and Jude and Irene will be interested in that, because I mean, I'm lucky because I see a consultant because I'm a type 1. I don't see my GP.
Yeah, it's not.
I've had consistency of care, but people going through the GPs haven't. Okay, yeah, thank you very much for the presentation.
No, thank you, Diane.
Very interesting. It was very interesting.
Oh, thank you.
I had diabetes ketoacidosis.
Oh, did you?
So I know how serious it is. Yeah. I was in ITU for 7 days.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, so it is serious, deadly serious. That's how I put it. Okay, I'll leave it to somebody else to talk now.
Right, thank you. I'll share everyone's details with Louise, and then if she can circulate them. If you know of anyone who is struggling to access care, whether they've got type 1, type 2, one of the rarer kinds, just get in touch with Yvonne. That's what she's here for, and it's really, really good to hear that. Obviously not good for the people living with diabetes, but it's good to know that's the experience that a lot of people have in Halton, Diane. So thank you. I'll feed that back to Yvonne as well.
Thanks, Diane. Over to Paul. Did you have a question, Paul?
Yeah, I did. Emma, thank you very much. I've always been very confused about diabetes. I never quite understand. It's quite complicated. And it's strange how you find out about things. I was watching an episode of Valanda, and he keeled over at one point, and he got what they called HONK, H-O-N-K. That's non-ketonic attack. But why I'm bringing that in is that I always find it very confusing. When I was at work, in a meeting, a chap, he must have had an hypo attack. And I didn't know what the heck was going on. You know, he went delirious, his speech was wandering. I didn't know what to do. And somebody came in, and this is where it confused me entirely, because they said he needs to have some sugar. And I'm thinking, diabetes, giving him sugar? I don't understand. You know, and so I've always had this confusion. But I'm only saying this to say thank you, because you've just explained to me what's going on with diabetes. And it's very useful to know this information. So it's just a big thank you, actually, Emma. It's not a question.
Oh. Well, thank you so much, Paul. I spotted Diane smiling there as well, because she'll be well familiar with treating with sugar and things. It's really important when somebody is having a low in their blood that it's a fast-acting carbohydrate as well. So one where the sugar is going to get released into your bloodstream really quickly, because that sometimes causes confusion as well. They might go for bread, which is like, oh, that's quite high carb content, but it's actually a lot slower releasing. So it's something like Jelly Babies. The Lucozade fizzy energy drinks are a big one that a lot of people use to treat hypos. So we had a bit of a nightmare when Lucozade actually reduced the sugar content in some of their drinks without actually telling people. So we had loads of people with type 1 diabetes being like, it didn't help as much as usual. And then it was actually because they'd done that to avoid the sugar tax and not told us. Well, not told anyone really. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of misconception. People think, oh, if you've got diabetes, you can't have sugar at all. But actually you can. It's just like everything. It's just all about in moderation. And with type 2, you can still have sugar as well. It's just about living with moderation. And if you're using medication, adapting your medication to fit what you've eaten that day as well.
Thanks, Paul. I had a question. Well, I had a couple of questions actually, Emma, and I think you answered them throughout your presentation about gestational diabetes. And the first question was, does that eventually right itself? And that she said as soon as the lady's given birth, she's monitored. Yeah. And I was just about to say as well, while they're actually pregnant, if they have diabetes and then they're pregnant, does that cause, they have to be monitored extremely closely, or does that kind of, how does that work?
They definitely get more monitoring than the average pregnant woman would. So they'll have more checkups and be more supported. And in terms of like giving birth as well, there'll be more people kind of on hand. But people can absolutely have perfectly healthy babies and things. They just have a little bit more support throughout. It's just making sure that mum's blood sugar's all right. Sometimes being pregnant, especially if they've got type 1, it can qualify them for some of the tech that previously they may have been unable to fit the criteria for, because some of the tech to get it funded on the NHS is quite a tight criteria to be able to get it. So being pregnant often can be part of that criteria. So you may be able to get like the freestyle lever device that I mentioned, for example, so you can do those checks a little bit more often without, stabbing your poor fingers to death. So it can sometimes qualify them for more tech support, but also they'll have more checkups and just to make sure that the baby's doing all right. And really interesting that I learned, so our regional head, I hope she doesn't watch this and is like, but she's quite open, so I'm hoping she won't mind me telling this. She's had 3 babies and all perfectly fine, but she said that when they're born, because they've got a higher sugar, the babies are quite big, but then they pee it all out basically. And she said that she had her baby and she held him, and then when she saw him a bit later on after they'd kind of took him, and she was like, that's not my baby, he's bigger than that. And actually it was just a bit like swollen and stuff. I'm probably not telling that perfectly, but yeah, she was just a bit like, hey, you've gone so much smaller.
Great, thank you. That's great. I know we've got Irene next, and then over to Maureen. Okay, Irene.
I know I've actually witnessed someone having a hypoglycemic attack. It was my lecturer at university. Unfortunately, he told us that he was diabetic. And my friend who was doing the course with me, she was a trained nurse. She'd come out of nursing and gone into work. And what she gave him was a tiny drop of milk. And I don't know why. She said, she just asked, we were in this little bar and we were discussing this essay, and she just went to the barman, can you get me some milk quick? Because his behaviour, and if you didn't know, you'd think they were drunk. And that's the danger, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
That is the danger.
It really is, and that's why a lot of people, and they absolutely don't have to, and they shouldn't have to, but a lot of people who have either type of diabetes sometimes wear either a medical bracelet, or as Diane's modelling one there, and carry something in the wallet to just let people know, because like you said, sometimes the symptoms, it seems like somebody's drunk, and there have been cases in the past of people being arrested drunk and disorderly. And sometimes your hypo can get that severe that you can't even communicate like, oh, I have diabetes. So nobody thinks to test them, and someone can get, locked up and then be seriously ill when they're next checked upon. And we've had Merseyside Police have been brilliant. They had a support group actually in the police for people with diabetes, but also just to inform their own officers to watch out, to be aware and to look out for whether people are carrying any kind of identification, but also to ask as well. I mean, it's going to be difficult to 100% of the time. Sometimes if someone's hypo is so severe, they can't even kind of communicate or even answer that question, do you have diabetes? But even just having more police, more public being aware that that might be part of the reason that somebody's behaving the way they're behaving, and just to be aware of that. And my sister actually works in the police herself now, and I'm always talking to her about it. So there's one more officer on the streets that's more aware of it as well, and telling all of her other fellow officers as well.
The bar, when it happened, we did call the ambulance. The ambulance did come out. They didn't take him into hospital. Just put him in another room and sorting him out. But it just made me think, you wouldn't know if someone was drunk. He was his head and laying on the floor and everything, and we were like, what's up with him?
Yeah.
It was only that my friend was a nurse that she said he's diabetic. She went
and paramedics will
told us that, but we didn't know he'd have all these hypoglycemic attacks.
It's another really good tip to kind of take away. In first aid kits, a lot of them, they don't naturally include kind of hypo treatments. You can actually order specific hypo first aid kind of kits, which include glucose tablets, kind of the juices that you can get and things. So if you're at an event and you're with someone with diabetes, you've got really quick access to this kind of fast acting glucose there. You can get them online really cheap. They're not super expensive. They're pretty readily available. So that's a good takeaway maybe to when you're packing kind of a first aid kit, to if you know that somebody has diabetes, or even if you don't know, quite often you've got to be wary of the dates. But correct me if I'm wrong, Dan, they've normally got a relatively long shelf date, the glucose tablets.
I don't know.
I have glucogel, and it's got quite a long. I always carry one in my handbag and one in the car.
Yeah, they're really useful. So maybe just including them in first aid kits is always just a good start. As well, a lot of our staff use fresh orange juice to treat if they're going into a hypo. And one of the girls that I work with keeps a jar of these really sugary sweets on her desk, ready to go. So if we start to notice she's really focused, and if we start to notice that she's kind of not concentrating as much, we can be like, have you had your sweets?
Thanks very much, Emma. Can we go over to Maureen? Did you have a question, Maureen?
It's not a question, it was just an unusual situation we found ourselves in. When my son was being treated for leukemia, he was on steroids with his chemo, and we experienced steroid-induced diabetes, which was insulin dependent. So within 24 hours, we had to learn how to administer insulin, and I'd never heard of it before, but it was quite daunting at the time.
Yeah, I've heard that before as well. As cancer treatment, people finding that it then induces diabetes, whether it's from steroids or from other treatments as well. It's definitely something I've heard of a few times. But like you, Maureen, I hadn't heard of it before. It wasn't until I worked here that I even knew that could be a...
Yeah, and we were really fortunate that it did reverse back.
Yeah.
When the treatment finished, because my worry was that my husband's father is a type 1 diabetic, insulin dependent, and has been for over 50 years. Yeah. So my worry was that because he had flipped to insulin dependent, that he would stay that way, but he never. He never. Cool. So as quick as it started, he actually recovered from it.
Is he doing well now?
Yeah, he's finished treatment, so we're in that 5-year window. Or he's just finished his first year at uni, so he's a lazy student now till September. Oh, but I think he's allowed to be lazy, but don't tell him.
Oh that. Yeah, I think he's bought himself.
But he was treated at Alder Hay, and their diabetic department were amazing. They were up on the ward within hours, and we had one go on the orange, and then that was it. So, but yeah, it was quite daunting because we didn't have any build up to it. It was just like, you've got to do this.
Yeah, it is. It's so immediate, and it's what our regional head did. Obviously, she couldn't get us to try injecting ourselves. That would have been dangerous. But what she did, just to give those of us staff who don't live with diabetes a bit of an insight, was when we were doing some hypo awareness raising training, she brought along the Lancet device for doing finger prick testing, and had us all do a finger prick test just to kind of get a little bit of insight of what it's like for someone living with diabetes. And even just that little, there's so much nerves behind it when you're waiting for because it's on a spring and waiting for it to kind of ping. And it didn't, I got it in the right place first time, luckily, so it didn't hurt. It was just the anticipation and knowing having to do that multiple times a day and then follow it up with an injection. It's so incredible that people will adapt, and I just take my hat off.
And I have to say, the way that the insulin's now administered through the pen,
much better.
That is a godsend, because you know, I don't know if you would cope, you have to cope, but the idea of administering an actual injection, I'm not sure I would be comfortable with that.
Or if you look at the size of the needles as well that they used to use, like we've got some volunteers that have had diabetes for so long and type 1 diabetes, and they share quite often those pictures of the treatments that they had when they were first diagnosed, and it's crazy. Like, we've come so far so quickly. Really. But the size
we've actually got all the pens that Matthew had, and a load of the little injection heads. Is there anyone that could use those for training or anything?
Let me find out. If I let Louise know, have you got more of these details, Louise? Because you're not the first person to ask this, and
so because rather than throw them away,
no, there will be some. I'm sure there's someone somewhere who can use them. I'm trying to think if I've had an answer for this before. I'm sure that one of our volunteers asked this quite recently. I'm just having a quick check and seeing what the answer was that I got then. I can find it.
I mean, even for new patients, just to see what a pen looks like, and
no, it's really helpful, isn't it? Like, I took we took all the needles out, obviously, but I took a Lancet device to a school that I was at once, just to show the kids kind of what it looked like, and they were so fascinated by it, and it just gave them a really good insight. And you know what kids are like, they like to touch stuff and to know.
That's right,
and hence taking all the needles out. But I will find out. I hope I can find it in my emails quicker than that. I can't find the answer at the moment, but I will
feed it back to Louise, and I can get anything to you that's of any use.
Oh, thank you so much.
But yeah, it's been an absolutely fantastic presentation, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. It's been really informative, and if there's anything that we can do to promote anything for you, we've got e-bulletins, we've got social media, we've got websites. There's anything that you'd like us to help promote for you, you know, please forward it on to us. Really liked the video. I think that was the easiest thing for me to grasp, having no background at all, no information and completely no knowledge. Fascinating story about the scorpion. If I'd have stayed away from them anyway, but absolutely avoiding them at all costs now. But yeah, it was an absolutely fantastic session. So thank you for your time. Thank you for the slides, and thank you for everybody attending. But I've really, really enjoyed the session today.
Oh, thank you so much. Hopefully you're always worried, don't you? Like, I hope I'm not being very boring, or I talk too quick, or my country accent hasn't. I mean, I've been living in Liverpool now for 5 years, and I keep being told that I'm starting to sound a bit scouse, so it's like I'll keep at it. But thank you so much for having me, and
it's been a pleasure. Thoroughly enjoyed it. So thank you everybody for attending, and thank you, Emma. It's been fabulous. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And we'll speak soon and catch up about making arrangements for volunteers meetings, and we can drop in and
that'd be amazing. Thank you, Louise. And I've made some notes of things I'm going to follow up on, and I'll also send you the presentation. I'll probably have to Dropbox it though, because it's quite big, so it doesn't fit as an attachment, unfortunately. But I can Dropbox it. And yeah, anyone who's on YouTube and things, Philip Schofield did another couple of videos in that line as well, went into a little bit more detail, still quite short and snappy, but just one specific for type 1 and one specific for type 2 as well. But we've also got like new videos around symptoms, and we've just done loads of really nice campaigns over the years where we've got people living with diabetes to talk. And this week is Diabetes Week, as my background is, and this week we've got people living with diabetes kind of taking over the organisation. I mean, we're a good organisation anyway, that a lot of our staff do live with diabetes. They're so fantastic at employing people who live with diabetes, but our volunteers and our supporters are kind of taking the mic. And actually today, one of our volunteers from the north of England is on our social media today, called Cultart, and he is fantastic. So if anybody is online today, just have a look, and he's telling his story today. But yeah, so it's diabetes.
Brilliant. Okay, and I'll keep in touch with you, Emma, separately, but anything else that you want to pass on, let me know. And I can
thank you so much. Thank you for everything.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Emma. Bye.